Well, I got a few questions for some people, so I'll quick do those, answer yours, and then I'm done. And probably be the only time I'll do a review session. Okay, so if you have any questions, I'll give you a sec. Go and get your review packet out. And I'll record it for the people who aren't here, but okay. All right, so basically I'm just going to go through periods 1 through 4, and I'll do 4 again. Well, my plan was to do 4 again next time, but it appears like most people don't need a review session. So, if you guys got any questions, just go ahead and say it. Do I have volume? Why don't I have volume? You can either say it or just type it on chat, and I'll quick answer it. Yes, I still have a French tank behind me. And so on page 1, I was asked about encomienda. And encomienda, you'll see it's right in the middle of period 1. And, period 1, there's probably going to be just maybe 3 multiple choice questions. There might be a short answer question that will indirectly have something to do with period 1. But overall, we probably don't have to worry too much about period 1. We just got to know some basics. In the past, we've had some questions about the various tribes. So we had one that compared the Southwest, the Plains, and the Eastern Mississippi and the Iroquois, and that's the big one you need to know. And we have had questions on the Columbian Exchange. They have been there before. The encomienda has been a choice, so it's a good one to know. And the encomienda, that is a Spanish plantation. And it was basically land that the Spanish had conquered, part of New Spain, royal land that they divvied up to noblemen and conquistadors. And so the conquistadors could get them. They could basically, that was a payment for them to conquer New Spain. And the big thing about that is that the American Indians who lived there, so the various tribes, as you remember, they're absolutely devastated by disease, but they would become, in essence, slaves. Think of them more as serfs. And this would directly connect with conquistadors. Columbus basically started it, but this would be the system of Spanish colonies. And the next one down there, we have, okay, section 2, and I'll come back to that if there's any questions on section 2 for the few of us that are here. But by the way, I've noted. But period 3, I have a couple questions. I'll just quick go through these since I already have them down for people. So people have posted them for me, so I just posted on so I would not forget. And I'll talk about period 2 when I get a chance. Period 3, you'll notice just a little bit more. This is good fodder for a short answer question, maybe one regular essay question, or maybe a DBQ. We had a run of about 3 DBQs in a row from this era. And so there's a chance there might be more from that era, but we're not sure. I put down 12% of the test, 6 questions maybe, and then maybe one choice for a short answer question. Almost certainly, you got to look at things like, period 3. You're looking at the events leading up to the Revolutionary War and the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the writing of the Constitution, and the Federalist era. Those are the big events: Federalist era, Constitution, Articles of Confederation, Declaration of Independence, and the Revolutionary War, and then the events leading up to the Revolutionary War. Those are the big events. They boom, 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 boom. And if you're writing an essay from period 3, writing an essay about that, that's the kind of stuff that would be in your context. So if you're writing about the Declaration of Independence, your context would be some of the events that led up to the Revolutionary War and Lexington and Concord. If you're writing about the Constitution, you would write in some of your context about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. That's the stuff you have to put in your opening paragraph. That's 1 point, that's 1/5 of your points for a regular essay and 1/7 of your point for a DBQ. So let's get back to these ones. Ratification Battle. And so that's on, the top of page 3. And that is a fight between the Federalists, who were for the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who were against. And the Anti-Federalists were opposed to the Constitution because it had too strong of a central government, and it had the power of double taxation. It weakened the states, but don't forget the big one, too strong of a central government. Too strong of a central government. And one of the biggies, it didn't have a militia, state-controlled militia to put down slave rebellions. The Federalists were for the Constitution, and they had the great advantage of being for one document. And they would be for the Constitution because they wanted the strong central government. They wanted a government to be able to regulate the economy and print currency. They wanted a government that would be able to speak for one foreign policy. Oh, I almost forgot one of the Anti-Federalists. I'm sorry. Another one of the Anti-Federalist arguments, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my tank and my picture and it got me distracted. Another Anti-Federalist one was no Bill of Rights. No Bill of Rights. But strong central government, also a court system that would function, and they wanted the power to tax, strong financial system. I can't emphasize enough the strong central government. And I should add, the Federalists thought that the old system, the Articles of Confederation, had too much democracy. Too much democracy. And so that's why they wrote it as a republic. The Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. They were all for the Constitution. The most famous was Madison's Federalist number 10, where it bragged that in this new system, we won't need political parties. Another one. Oh, does anyone else have a question real quick? If you want to have one, type one in. If not, I'll go right to the tariff. And the tariff was one of Hamiltonian economics, and he wanted a high protective tariff, which is a high tariff or a tariff on imports. And the whole goal of this was to keep out foreign, specifically British imports, so the United States could develop an economic system. And this was part of Hamiltonian economics, with the idea being that Hamilton wanted to aid the very wealthy as much as possible, the merchant class, not the plantation owners, the merchants, so they would build industry. This did not pass because Washington, the president, was a farmer and didn't like tariffs, but a small revenue tariff. But this would be the essence of Hamiltonian economics and conservative economics. Remember, if you have a question, type it into chat on this and I will get it. So that's period 3. So period 4, I got a couple questions for period 4. I'll get to that right now. That's 1848 to 1800 to 1848. 10% of the exam, yeah, that's a pretty good hunk. And so we're basically talking the Jeffersonian era, the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial and Market Revolution. The AP likes to use the term market revolution, so don't forget that term. That just means capitalism and the new financial system and trade. That also includes the Jacksonian era and Manifest Destiny, culminating with the Mexican War. And so it's a big era, but since it doesn't have the Declaration of Independence, it kind of ends there. Oh, and then also a series of reforms like abolitionists, jail reform, the women's rights movement that developed out of the Industrial Revolution. So let's get to these really fast. Jefferson's philosophy was also Republican philosophy. And the key elements were that that Jefferson wanted, or at least claimed he wanted, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. A strict interpretation of the Constitution. Also, Jefferson was obsessed with the West. He wanted to expand westward. Also, he wanted to be, he wanted an agrarian nation. So he wanted a nation made up of small farmers. His idea, and this goes back to the Declaration of Independence, small farmers will have the most liberty and freedom to make good decisions in a republic. And he really pushed the idea of the common man, with the idea that there should not be only a rule by the aristocracy, that people of common birth and not of wealthy birth should have power. Now, don't get me wrong. Jefferson thought he should have the power, but he thought that the common man should have the gold, and the only way the common man will be protected would be by farmers. But the biggest part of Jefferson's philosophy was pragmatic. He was practical. And so, yes, he said he was against big government, or he wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution, yet he went to a war with the Barbary pirates without declaring war. He bought the Louisiana Purchase when it was not clear from the Constitution the U.S. could buy land. And he claimed he was pro-slavery. I'm sorry, he claimed he was anti-slavery. And yet he did everything possible to get more land. And so that leads to this Jeffersonian idea that, yes, he made these statements, but he still wants the basic expansion of the United States. And to be honest with you, he was still a slaveholder and a plantation owner. The War of 1812, I know we're going to do a very quick issue about the war. But the thing about the war was they blamed the British for the troubles, especially with Tecumseh, the one above in Tippecanoe. And so for security in the frontier and to get Canada, they wanted new land and neutrality rights. Remember, the British were stopping American ships and were impressing sailors. And so the big deal about the War of 1812 is that they claimed they wanted land, security on the frontier, so they could knock out the American Indian threat to expand westward, and then stop the British from impressing sailors and stopping American ships, neutrality rights. And that was the big issue of the war. And so the U.S. declared war on Britain. The U.S. did not do well. In fact, the capital was even burnt down. So the American forces did not do well. And even Washington was captured and burnt down. And so this was almost a humiliating defeat of the United States. But they did drive back the American Indian threat. So this would be a big war against American Indians. And the British did not want to fight anymore. So they would sign the Treaty of Ghent, which basically went back to the original. I forgot that line. Yeah. So they basically went back to the way it was before, like nothing changed. But the Battle of New Orleans would make Andrew Jackson a hero. And it happened after the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1815. And it gave the United States the opinion, the feeling that they were winning, the war. And let's see, what other thing? Oh, and so the War of 1812, the big impact on that is it gave the United States the opinion that they had won the war. Why did we get someone to say yes and he's not here? Whatever. Okay. But gave the United States the idea they're going to win. But the big thing about the War of 1812 was the development of, and you got to get this down, nationalism. That the United States had great pride for itself and the nation, and that is when they started to refer to themselves as Americans. This is our continent. And the other biggie, it would trigger the Industrial Revolution. Please, if you have any ones you want to write down, type it in. Let me think. Okay. Dartmouth versus Woodward. Dartmouth versus Woodward's a court case. What do we have here? Okay, so it's one of the Marshall court cases, and Dartmouth versus Woodward would protect the sanctity of contracts. We'll say that contracts are sacred and protected under federal law. That contracts are sacred and protected under federal law. And so that would give more power to the Industrial Revolution because business is all about contracts. Next, the corrupt bargain. She typed in baton and I didn't catch that. So the corrupt bargain of 1824, that is when there was a four-way race for president and it went to the United States House of Representatives. Went to the U.S. House of Representatives. And the big race was between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And even though Jackson won the popular vote, remember that doesn't matter. No one had the majority in the Electoral College. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, threw his support to Adams, who wanted Clay's American system. And that would lead to Adams winning the presidency in the House of Representatives and Clay becoming the Secretary of State. And Jackson supporters said it was a corrupt bargain. Adams bought Clay off and gave him the position of Secretary of State, which seemed like he was picking his successor. And this would help boost the Democratic Party. Nullification of the Tariff of 1832. So I didn't leave much space there. Remember, this whole thing was for you to write little bit elements of it and come up with your own shorthand to write this down. But this is one of the most important and underrated events in American history. And so this was the South, specifically John C. Calhoun at the time was the vice president, who wanted to use nullification. He wanted to use nullification to unify the South to protect slavery. So use the nullification, which means they would not follow or obey state laws within the state. And so they would nullify, South Carolina would nullify the Tariff of 1832, even though that was a reduction from the Tariff of Abominations of 1828. They would nullify this tariff, saying we won't enforce the tariff within the state of South Carolina. But the whole goal was not the tariff so much as unifying the South. Now, agricultural states don't like the tariff because they don't have industry. And so tariffs, remember I told you this before, raise all prices, so farmers have to pay higher prices. But the big thing is unify the South. And it looked like it was going to happen. It looked like the South would be unified, and this would be a huge divide. Calhoun's goal, unify the South to protect slavery so a civil war won't be necessary, which, by the way, is insane. He was an insane, horrible person. But Jackson reacted hard. He used the Force Act, which said, okay, a little person just walked by our picture window in our front yard, a little, not very tall person, and he had two massive dogs who were like taller than them. I couldn't help it. I wish I could turn the camera on. I know what you're thinking. Wow, more pieces of your life. It impressed me. Don't look out the window. See, this is why you can't have classes outside. You know, you say, oh, look, there's a dog. Okay, back to this. So Jackson reacted with the force bill that said the U.S. government will enforce the laws. And so this intimidated the rest of the South. So they did not join with Calhoun and South Carolina, and they did not nullify the tariff because Jackson promised to react with force. And then Jackson turned around and in secret began to collect the tariff off the shore. But the biggie is Andrew Jackson would help negotiate a compromise tariff to lower the tariff. So Jackson ended this first massive threat of civil war. This is one of the biggest one, even bigger than the Compromise of 1820 issue, the Missouri Compromise. Now, Calhoun turned down Jackson's compromise tariff and actually got a worse deal when, and do get this one down, Henry Clay's compromise tariff. So the nullification crisis within, South Carolina was subdued. Jackson arguably saved the Union because if it would have been civil war then, if they all would have nullified it, there would have been civil war and the South would have won. I can't, just the U.S. be over. Okay, so that's nullification. A big deal. And that's Jackson standing up to the big money interests in the South. Let's go divide over capitalism, free labor. So let's look down at the bottom. So capitalism was an intensely divisive issue. This new economic system. And remember, the big thing about capitalism was that wage system. So workers went from being independent, deciding their own fate, working their hours, more and more to working in a factory and be dependent upon the capitalist to have the machines. And if the capitalist isn't selling their product, they lose their job and they starve. And wages, and the other big thing is the divide is wages are no longer decided by how hard you work or your skill. Wages are decided by the wage system. I mean, it's a little more complex than just simple supply and demand, but that's what it is. So free labor was the attitude that capitalism was a good thing. Capitalism was creating, and this is an important word, opportunity. It was all this opportunity. And if you show ingenuity, initiative, creativity, and have some luck, you can prosper, and maybe someday you can become the capitalist. Free labor means that labor was free to decide their own fate. And if they don't like their job, they can quit and go get another job, and maybe someday they can own the factory. This dynamic, incredible system of capitalism. And if you don't make it, it's your own fault, because there's so much opportunity. And so free labor means that these are people who feel part of the system, that capitalism is working for me. Anywhere you want to type down? Okay, I'll get back to the other ones that people wrote down. Growth of parties, Democrats. And so after the era of good feeling, where there's only one party, basically the Republican Party, you might see them called this, and they do this in a textbook, the Democratic Republicans, but don't forget, they called themselves Republicans. But with that, where are we at here? So the Democrats. And these were followers of Andrew Jackson. They literally called themselves the democracy. And what they were these, or this was the party of the common man. As they saw it, they were the successors to By the way, I got a couple more messages. Did everyone just kind of log on from the link I gave you? So I gave a couple different links, and then also on Team USA. Did people just log on to there that way? I'll get back to growth of the parties or Democrats, but I'm getting people to say they can't log in, and I just said, click the link. Or did you just randomly come across this?
I went to my calendar, and then it has all the meetings listed.
Yeah, I have it on, I should have on the calendar. I have it on the schedule. I have included on the chat with a post on for every period, which I put down stuff every day. And so then we have Partridge Team USA. I have the links to it, so I have plenty of links. All right, well, it should not be hard. Okay, so back to this. Let me do one thing really quick. Huh? No, that worked. All right, so back, the growth of parties. So the Democratic Party started as this party of the common man. They saw themselves as the true successor to the Jeffersonians. And as they looked at it, this party of the common man, they felt that they were kind of left out of the system. And so they were ones who believed that capitalism was actually creating slave or wage slaves. And so they feared capitalism. And that is why they did not like government programs like Henry Clay's American System, which is on here, I hope. Do I have Henry Clay's American System? Did I just think about Henry Clay's American System? Yeah, I have Henry Clay's American System on the bottom of page 3. That was tariffs, Bank of the U.S. and internal improvements. And they feared the national, or the, so they feared the power of the federal government only helping the very wealthy. They feared that idea. And so they wanted more expansion westward. And a big thing they wanted was the more suffrage. They wanted universal suffrage. They wanted democracy. And this was the party then that the Whigs would be the opposition to. And so as they saw it, they're going to be fighting for small farmers and working people, the South and the West. Okay, so I went through about 8 or 9 of people that had ones that are there, Encomienda and a few others. Anybody else want to type something in on that first 4 section? All right, transportation revolution, very good. And that one is on the bottom of page 4. So the second from the top, the big thing about the transportation revolution is this went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, hand in hand. So the Industrial Revolution and the market revolution. In fact, arguably the market revolution is the Industrial Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, and capitalism all coming together. But the Transportation Revolution was basically starting with the War of 1812 and the need to move troops around. And it began with the building of roads. And so a few roads, most famously the national roads, but roads are very expensive to build and hard to maintain. The next big wave would be canals, and canals would dramatically drop shipping charges. And the last big one would be railroads. And railroads would start with relatively slow in the 1830s and 1840s, but the number of railroads would explode in the 1850s. And the big thing about railroads is not only would it dramatically drop shipping charges, but basically just shrink the size of the country, because things could move around so much quicker and would trigger, this is an important thing about railroads. Railroads themselves would be an industry that required all the materials of the Industrial Revolution. So we have the railroads providing for the Industrial Revolution to build more railroads, which provided more in the Industrial Revolution. And the big thing about the Transportation Revolution is this. It dramatically dropped costs by over 50% in the first 50 years of the 19th century. 50% drops in costs. That means it became cheaper, and therefore companies could profit when they could ship raw materials to one factory and then ship those to other locations. And once you have that, the Transportation Revolution, that would allow for factories to form and goods to be shipped. The world would get smaller. Families would start becoming consumers. Everything would change within the family after the Transportation Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. Families bought more goods. They became less dependent upon themselves or dependent upon themselves for goods. And the role of women changed dramatically because they were no longer economically as important as men. One more thing about the Transportation Revolution, inbreeding went down because now you can meet people outside of your line of sight. Okay, Seneca Falls, that's in the bottom of, that's middle page 3, is that right? I lost Seneca Falls.
It's on page 4.
Can't find it. I found it. Okay, did you already get the call to domesticity? So you just
Yeah, I have that part.
Say it again.
Yeah, I have the cult of domesticity part.
Yeah, the cult of domesticity, and remember, and the big thing about all these would come out of the Industrial Revolution with the changing role of women. But Seneca Falls in 1848 was the first women's rights conference in world history, beating Britain, which the women's rights movement started in Britain because they had the Industrial Revolution first. But in here would state the goal that all men and women should be created equal. But the big number one goal would be the long fight for suffrage, which Lucy Cady Stanton and then Susan B. Anthony would spend the rest of their life desperately, or not desperate, but fighting for this right to suffrage. With the idea being, at Seneca Falls, if women are going to have economic rights, legal rights, they can't have that till they have political rights and therefore can change laws. In fact, that's why voting is such a big deal. Being the right to vote, you can vote for change. And that's why there's always a continuous fight against people in the United States to this day, in fact, right now, to keep people from voting. So Seneca Falls is a biggie. Any others? Oh, Great Plains and the Sioux. So that's on section 1. Where are we at here? Oh, yeah. Section 1. And these are talking about the Great Plains tribes. And the big thing about the Great Plains tribes before Columbus arrived, the populations by necessity were always very small tribes because there's a limited amount of water and therefore a limited amount of food. And so by definition, they are going to be mostly nomadic. Yes, they would have some camps where they have a centralized location in the summer, maybe plant some crops around a river, but they would basically move, following the bison herds for the most part. And so they were relatively small tribes on the Great Plains, tied to the bison. I'm trying to think of anything else. And the big thing about them would be is, so they would fight bigger for land all the time, but relatively small, pushing each other, a number of fights. But they would dramatically change when the Spanish brought the horse in the 16th century. And that would dramatically change the Plains tribes, because those who survived the wrath of diseases, they could move much faster and made it in a way easier to follow the bison herds, change their whole style of hunting, but also have the more continuous conflicts. And two very large subgroups of a group that the British, the French, and the Spanish called the Sioux, so we lumped it together as the Sioux, would be probably the most powerful groupings of Plains Indian tribes of the Northern Plains. And they were mostly on the Mississippi River, but once they got the horse, they came into North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, into Montana, and that would become the most powerful of the Plains tribes. But by definition, they're going to be very small, because you have to move around following the herds. Chesapeake Colonies. So Chesapeake Colonies, those are the colonies around the Chesapeake Bay. And so they're basically Virginia, and remember that started as Jamestown, but Virginia and Maryland colony. There's an element of, Delaware's a little bit like this, and so is the upper North Carolina, but it's basically Virginia and Maryland. And the main element of their economy would be large plantations, loosely based on the big English country estates, growing tobacco. It would be a tobacco, basically intense cultivation of tobacco. And the other part of the colony economy then, by the end of the 17th century, would be slavery, because it's going to require so many people to work this constant shortage of labor to pick the tobacco, to cultivate it. And so slavery is going to become big business in the Chesapeake colonies too. And it's going to be run by an aristocracy of planters in Virginia known as the Burgesses. And poor whites as indentured servants and slaves would be the bottom of the structure, the bottom of that economic structure, and they would eventually rebel in Bacon's Rebellion. Is there another one? New France. Okay, so New France and Champlain. So in the middle of the 17th century, where are we at? Yeah, the top of period 2. And I really don't know how much of a question there would be. It would not surprise me if there would be a short answer question on like the Spanish, the French, and comparing the Spanish, the French, and the British. Something like that, where you had to give up like New France, New Spain, and then like Jamestown. And I could see that, maybe a couple multiple choice questions, but one of those short answer questions is one of your choices. Okay, where am I at here? Okay, so New France or Champlain. And so in the middle of the 17th century, Champlain would sail through the Great Lakes and then down through much of the Mississippi River, or down the Mississippi River, as pretty close to New Orleans in the middle of the 17th century, and would give France a claim to that. So France is end up going to have a claim on the St. Lawrence River, much of the Great Lakes, and down the Mississippi River. And this will become New France. And the French, partially because they have more land and they didn't have the enclosure movement, they didn't have as many people come from New France as Britain. And so there would be French colonists, but they never really, or there weren't as many displacing American Indians. So New France is going to have better relations with American Indians than the British or the Spanish colonies. And yes, the French will be farmers and traders, but the big thing the French are going to be involved in is the fur trade. The fur trade. And they will have Catholic missionaries. It will be all a royal colony in this area. And so that would be New France. So all the way from Quebec down, and yes, Lake Champlain would be named after him. And that would give France its claim all the way down to New Orleans. And this would put them in direct conflict with the British. Because when Champlain got to the Ohio River, he just said, I claim everything up this river. So he claimed all the way to where Pittsburgh is now. And then he got to the Mississippi and said, I claim everything up this river, meaning the French claimed everything, including where we're at right now. And that's what gave the French claim that would eventually the U.S. would buy the Louisiana Purchase. But that's New France, better relations, mostly fur traders. Is there another one? I'm just looking at the list. Okay, so Antebellum Reforms. Nope, and that's on page 4, I believe. So that's another one from Article 4. I could see a question about this, about individual reforms, and there's a chance that this could be like a short answer question. I'm winging it. I don't know. I don't think there would be an essay question on this. And the thing about it is that you're going to have 3 choices for essay questions, 1 DBQ, and that's it. And then 4 choices for short answer questions. You have to answer 3. And remember, that means 9 short IDs. Antebellum Reform. Okay, I lied. I can't find it. I made the thing. Did I even type in Antebellum Reform?
It's like 4 boxes down from page 4 on the right.
Oh my goodness. I was looking down. Okay, so the big thing to know about the Antebellum Reform is these are all coming from the Industrial Revolution. And antebellum means before the war. So all antebellum means is before the war. And this is going to have some negative connotations today because a lot of people think of antebellum and they think of the period of slavery. But it's literally just Latin for before the war. And so these are reforms that came out. They're reactions to the Industrial Revolution. They were these events that led to, or these changes caused by industrialization, the new wage system, the dislocation of people's jobs, the stress of now working for a living and being at the mercy of the market. And so these are all reactions. And so some of the biggies were transcendentalism. And transcendentalism was a philosophy that believed that people should transcend the empirical, this money-grubbing nature and go back to nature and like step above this and go back to where people did not care about such things. So leave all the money grubbers alone. And Nathaniel Hawthorne would be one of the most famous ones. And of course, Henry David Thoreau, who would write on civil disobedience about disobeying unjust laws because he didn't want to pay taxes. Another one would be Prohibition. And Prohibition, I put down Prohibition, but the big thing is the Temperance Movement. I think I had the 1920s on my mind, but the Temperance Movement was to cut back on drinking, which had a combination of 2 different reasons. First off, drinking too much at a time when now people are relying upon a wage that could drain money away and farmers could starve, but also employers did not want drunk workers. So that was a reform there. So they tried to push this idea as a moral reform. The big religious reform would be the Second Great Awakening. And so that was a reaction to this radically changing world. And so I have a box on its own for Second Great Awakening, but that's one of them. But not only that, there would be all these different cults and small religions that would reform. They were called cults by the church. Some would turn to more mainstream, some would disappear. And a reform to try to reform jail to make it actually like reform, but also this would be things like sentences. I don't know if this was a reform actually. And then of course suffrage, which was women's rights, and that put an arrow down to the cult of domesticity. So that's the idea of the right to vote for women. But the big thing about this was these were reactions to the Industrial Revolution. Events leading up to Bacon's Rebellion. Let's see if I can find that one. That's on page 1. I knew that. Okay. So the events leading up to Bacon's Rebellion. This is 1670. So the Bacon's Rebellion is 1676. And don't forget, Bacon's Rebellion is arguably one of the most important events in American history. It's hard to find an event bigger than Bacon's Rebellion. And so the events leading up to that were the big thing that was happening were that indentured servants, when they finally earned their freedom after 7 years, they got a head right. And a head right was a small portion of land, maybe some seeds, maybe an animal, but usually just 50 acres on general. So they would get this piece of land, so they would be treated horribly. And don't forget, it wasn't just indentured servants that came from Britain out of contract. Most slaves were treated like indentured servants. They just didn't have this set time. Remember, there's no such thing as permanent slavery. So they were given 50 acres. They had no representation in the House of Burgesses, the representative body for the Virginia colony. So, but they got this little piece of land. But what was happening is with twofold. Either they were getting land that was used up by intensive tobacco cultivation, so it was worthless, and they would become broke and essentially become day laborers for no pay, virtually no pay, or they would give them the land way out on the western frontier as a buffer between the big plantations and the American Indians desperately fighting for their land. And so they're the ones to be attacked. And so they would rebel because they were basically getting cheated. They're treated miserably and horribly as a slave or indentured servant and finally get a little bit of freedom, and they're the ones being killed or having terrible land. So that's the big thing about the events leading up to it. And don't forget, Bacon's Rebellion would change everything. Lead to the slave codes and the fornication laws and racism. And Bacon's Rebellion, thinking it's gone on to, let me do my act here. At about 7:43, it's still going on, p.m. Mountain Standard Time. What's the date today? The 21st. Okay, the bus. So the bus. By the way, should I keep the tank? It's a Hotchkiss. The Bank of the United States, and that's on page 3, and that's another one of Hamiltonian's reforms. And Hamilton wanted a Bank of the United States to be created by Congress that would collect government revenues. But the big thing it would do would create a banking system, and here's the biggie, it would print the currency backed by taxes. Okay, remember what I told you, currency cannot survive unless there's a tax system. It just breaks down. We talked about that with hyperinflation. So that was Hamiltonian's idea, loosely based upon the Bank of Britain. So they'll collect taxes, print the currency, and therefore they can control the money supply. So they could control inflation or deflation, but also create a banking system. So this would help business growth. Business cannot function without credit. Remember, he wanted industry, that's why he wanted a tariff. The elastic clause, what that meant is that was the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. The Constitution does not say Congress can make a bank, but it says Congress can print money and collect taxes, and so that fits in with what the bank would be necessary and proper to print currency. So that's a clause that could be stretched. Another word for this would be implied powers. It's implied in the Constitution. And this would become debated all the way through to this day. Jefferson and Madison were furious about the Bank of the United States because they correctly saw that the Bank of the United States would be used to promote merchants and promote industry over farmers. And farmers are always in debt. And with easy credit, heck, there'll be even more debt. But it would pass. But only a 20-year law, and it would not be renewed under Madison. Any more? And don't forget when you're doing this, think about connecting them and relating them. The multiple choice questions, which I will give you some practice multiple choice tomorrow. The multiple choice questions, they'll have a little stimulus or something to trigger a memory. And they're pretty basic questions. You just got to get used to how they word them. But for essays and short answer questions, you have to be able to connect these to other things. So think about, the Bank of the United States was not just one isolated event. It was part of Hamilton's proposal to strengthen the government, and these would directly lead to the Assumption Bill, the Bank of the United States, and the Tariff. You notice I have all three in a row there. They would directly lead to the growth of the Federalist Party. That was the basis of it, the Federalist Party. There's no more questions? Okay, I'm going to give you one thing. If someone has a question, I will pop this up on the screen, And you're going to do something for me really quick before we go. And those of you who watch the recording, you have a thesis practice. Can you see it? Is it working? Now you see me. All right. So quick thesis and then you can go. Sound good? By the way, I like how attentive they are. He's looking right at me. I don't trust that kid at all. Thesis. Okay. So you have your sheet in front of you. Evaluate the extent of change in ideas about American independence from 1763 to 1783. By the way, I'm not a big fan of this question either. I don't like the way they word it, but that was
Mr.
actually a question.
Hartford,
Yeah.
we can't see the question.
Why can't you see it?
I'm not sure.
Would you like to see it? Want to see the kid? I'll show you the kids again. They changed the. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
They changed the way they did the sharing thing. And I still haven't quite figured it out. They had to change it, I think, just to change it. And once again, let me be clear about it. I don't trust that kid. I don't trust him. Okay, so here's your practice. Evaluate the extended change in ideas from American independence. So think about that's from the events all the way from the Treaty of Paris of 1763 to the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And remember all of those events. I know you have your packet in front of you. So think about something to tie it all together in the change of ideas towards independence. So Enlightenment or something. And then think of three big things that happened in those years. That would be your blueprint. Quick jot one down. I'll show you my example, and that will be it. Unless you have more questions. And don't worry too much about, try to get the main elements of the question in there, but come up with three big events of those years leading up to the American independence. And the big thing is, think about in terms of an essay, three things you could write, three good short IDs. Just a little bit longer, not quite, about 5 or 6 sentences with a couple of examples. Does anybody want to post theirs or read theirs? You want to see mine?
I have like half of mine done. I can read the first half.
Finish it. I'll give you another minute. Then read it. Why isn't this working? There we go. Okay, and that's pretty good blueprint. The Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and that. Now you want to think about kind of in order. So the Boston Massacre helped lead to the Tea Act, and so you want to make sure you get that in order. And other than that, that's a pretty good blueprint. We'd obviously, you want to make sure that you do lead somehow to the Declaration of Independence because it says American independence. Does that make sense? So American Declaration of Independence would be a good one to put in there. And the only thing I would have to say about yours, you don't really have a why, a common denominator. You just said the change of ideas. So you want to be change of ideas about, enlightened ideas or liberal ideas or something like that, or ideas about ideas leading up to the Declaration of Independence, or breaking away from Britain, or getting away from British tyranny. But other than that, it's good. Jacob, you have one?
Yeah. Basically, the initial intent of the colonial people was to bring about change in colonial law, but quickly changed to a desire to declare independence after the Tea Act, the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition, and I couldn't remember what the act was. Basically,
Did you go?
oh, I was muted. Oh, I said the initial actions of colonials was to bring about change in colonial law, but quickly changed to a desire to declare independence after the Tea Act, the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition, and then I couldn't remember what the act was called, where they passed it, and Britain was just essentially said that yes, we can tax you, you can't do anything about it.
The Declaratory Act.
Yes, that one.
Yeah, and those work. Just have to make sure it's ordered, because one thing led to another. You know what I mean? So Stamp Act led to the Declaratory Act, led to the Tea Act, that kind of thing.
Right.
Any others? You want to see mine? You're going to see mine. Maybe.
I have
There we go.
one.
Oh, let's go back. Go ahead.
Okay. I said, because of American independence, ideas such as how government should interact with the people changed through the introduction of slave codes, the ratification of the Constitution, and Hamilton's Tariff. I wasn't really sure what that was called.
The Hamilton Tariffs. Those are all, it's good organization. I'm glad you put down independence. You have a good why, but there is a problem. All three of the things in your blueprint aren't in those years.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Whoops.
Yeah. The slave codes, that goes back 100 years, and then, like Hamiltonian's Tariff happened in 1791. And so these are all the events like the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act, the Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, the Declaration of Independence. But you had a good organization. So we just kind of clarify what the events are. Any others? Let's look at mine real quick. So I want to talk about the idea of, enlightened ideas and then breaking away from Britain. So the whole thing about breaking away. And so I have the British taxation. So I can talk about the Stamp Act and things like that. The Tea Party and the Coercive Acts and the Declaration of Independence. And that's pretty close with just a basic format. And so my first paragraph will be about the taxes. So give a couple examples. The second one will be about the Tea Act, the Tea Party, so the Tea Act, and then the Coercive Acts that followed it. And the third, 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. Okay. If there's no more questions, look good. I'll do some more thesis statements next time if we do another review. I'll see how many people view this, but we're going to have more people in this for me to spend this much time on my own. So just letting you know. But I'm glad I could help you guys. And no more questions? Okay, I'll record this and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Partridge.
Thank you.
Bye.